In the isolated research station OMEGA-7, a quiet night shift operator was about to face the longest night of her life. What started as routine environmental monitoring took a shocking turn when she came face to face with professional military infiltrators intent on stealing classified climate data. Dr. Elara Quinn wasn't your typical research station analyst. For 18 months, she had spent her life mapping every system and passage of the Arctic facility, known for her obsessive attention to detail that colleagues dismissed as excessive caution. When she detected subtle anomalies in the communication arrays and perimeter sensors, she had no idea she was walking into a coordinated assault by trained killers. Quinn's methodical preparation and intimate knowledge of the station's infrastructure would lead to a tactical defense that would save not just her colleagues' lives, but irreplaceable climate research worth billions. What began as another solitary night shift monitoring atmospheric data would become a transformation from underestimated analyst to battlefield commander. The Arctic research community would never be the same after discovering that sometimes the quiet ones possess the deadliest strength of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence at Research Station Omega-7 was never truly silent. Dr. Elara Quinn moved through the dimly lit corridors with practiced quiet, her footsteps muffled by thermal boots that had walked these same paths for 18 months. The station breathed around her, ventilation systems cycling with mechanical precision, generators humming their steady bass note 3 levels below, and the occasional groan of reinforced steel adjusting to the Arctic's relentless grip. Outside, the polar night stretched endless and absolute, broken only by the aurora borealis painting green fire across the star-scattered dome of sky. She preferred the night shift. While her colleagues slept in the residential wing, Elara maintained her solitary vigil over the station's nervous system. Banks of monitors cast blue light across her narrow features as she recorded atmospheric readings, seismic measurements, and the delicate fluctuations of electromagnetic activity that danced through the upper atmosphere. Her supervisor, Dr. Chen, had once called her work, quote, obsessively thorough. She had taken it as a compliment. The operations hub occupied the station's heart, a circular chamber lined with displays that tracked everything from wind speed to solar radiation. Elara settled into her chair and pulled up the evening's data streams. Temperature outside, -42 Celsius. Wind speed, gusting to 60 kilometers per hour. Solar activity, elevated, with a significant storm building in the magnetosphere. She frowned at the solar readings. The electromagnetic disturbance was larger than the morning briefing had indicated. Not dangerous yet, but worth monitoring. Solar storms could scramble communications, interfere with satellite navigation, and, in extreme cases, damage electronic systems. She made a note in her log, her handwriting precise and unhurried. At 23:47, she began her first rounds. The corridor leading to the communications array felt different tonight. Elara paused outside the reinforced door, her hand resting on the security scanner. The subtle vibration she had grown accustomed to, the steady pulse of data flowing through fiber optic cables, seemed irregular. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. The electromagnetic hum was there, but it carried an odd harmonic, like a song being sung slightly off-key. Inside the communications chamber, banks of equipment hummed behind protective panels. Elara pulled up the diagnostic interface and studied the signal patterns. The primary satellite link showed normal function, but buried in the data streams were tiny interruptions, microsecond gaps that shouldn't exist. She isolated the anomalies and ran them through pattern analysis software. The results made her stomach tighten. The interruptions weren't random. They followed a pattern, arriving in clusters with mathematical precision. Natural interference would be chaotic, unpredictable. This looked deliberate. She tried raising the day shift supervisor on the internal comms. "Control, this is Quinn. Are you receiving?" Static answered her. She adjusted the frequency and tried again. More static. But this time she caught fragments of what might have been a voice, too distorted to understand. Elara returned to her console and pulled up the perimeter security feed. 12 cameras monitored the approaches to station OMEGA-7, their infrared sensors cutting through the Arctic darkness. Most showed empty expanses of wind-sculpted snow. Camera 7, positioned to watch the eastern approach, flickered intermittently. She switched to backup power for that unit, and the image stabilized. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow that didn't match the flowing patterns of blown snow. She enhanced the image, adjusting contrast and brightness, but found nothing definitive. Just the endless white expanse and the suggestion of something that might have been there. She logged the anomaly, 2,347 hours, camera 7 intermittent signal degradation, possible atmospheric interference. Solar storm activity elevated, recommend extended monitoring. At midnight, she attempted her scheduled check-in with the regional command center in Whitehorse. The powerful long-range transmitter should have reached across 800 kilometers of frozen wilderness without difficulty. Instead, she got a carrier wave filled with crackling static. Whitehorse Control, this is Station Omega 7. Do you copy? The static continued, occasionally shaped by what might have been human speech. She tried alternate frequencies, adjusted power output, and checked all connections. The equipment functioned normally, but something was blocking clear transmission. Elara pulled up the solar storm data again. The electromagnetic disturbance had intensified over the past hour, but not enough to explain complete communication failure. She cross-referenced the interference patterns with standard storm signatures and found discrepancies. The disruption was too focused, too selective. She opened a new log entry, 0005 HRS. Primary communications compromised. Pattern analysis suggests artificial interference source. Solar storm activity elevated but insufficient to explain total disruption. Recommend immediate technical assessment upon day shift arrival. At 0:15, the perimeter alert sounded. The alarm lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. Elara's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the security grid. Camera 9, watching the western approach, had triggered a motion sensor. She replayed the feed from 30 seconds before the alert. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Snow swirled in patterns dictated by wind and the station's thermal exhaust. Then, at the edge of the frame, she caught it. A disturbance in the snow that moved against the wind direction, something low to the ground, deliberate in its motion. She tried to enhance the image, but the feed cut to static. When it resumed 5 seconds later, the disturbance was gone. Elara felt her pulse quicken. She checked the other cameras systematically. Camera 3 showed a similar anomaly, a shadow moving through the equipment storage area where no one should be. Camera 12 captured what looked like footprints in fresh snow, but the image quality was too poor to be certain. She tried the internal communications again. Security, this is Control, please respond. No answer. She switched to Captain Mercer's direct line. Jonas Mercer ran station security with military precision, a former Special Forces operator who treated the Arctic posting as a chance to prove his peacetime readiness. He would want to know about potential perimeter breaches. Mercer, this is Quinn in Control. We may have a situation. Static greeted her, broken by fragments that might have been a human voice. She caught what sounded like routine and overreacting again, but couldn't be sure if it was Mercer or interference patterns creating phantom words. At 0:23, she made a decision that would save their lives. Instead of waiting for communications to clear or for someone else to investigate, Elara activated the station's security protocols from her console. She locked down all external access points, engaged additional perimeter sensors, and switched the station to heightened alert status. Red lights began pulsing in the corridors, and automated announcements instructed all personnel to report to designated stations. The announcement system worked perfectly. Whatever was interfering with their communications couldn't block internal hardwired connections. She heard movement in the residential wing as her colleagues responded to the alert. Dr. Mina Sorel's voice echoed from the direction of the climate lab, asking someone what was happening. Tomas Reddick's heavier footsteps approached from the engineering section, accompanied by his characteristic grumbling about false alarms. Elara pulled up the station schematic and began tracing possible entry points. Station Omega 7 had been designed to withstand Arctic conditions, but it wasn't a fortress. The main entrances were secured, but emergency exits, ventilation intakes, and utility access points could be vulnerable to someone with the right tools and knowledge. At 0:31, she heard it. a sound that didn't belong to the station's normal symphony of mechanical noises. A dull thud transmitted through the ventilation system. It came from somewhere in the eastern section, near the communications array she had checked earlier. Elara grabbed her tablet and pulled up the building's architectural drawings. The eastern section housed primary communications equipment, backup power systems, and several maintenance shafts that connected to external service panels. If someone wanted to disable the station's ability to call for help, that's where they would start. She tried Mercer's communicator again. This time she got a clearer response, though still distorted by static. "Quinn, what's status report?" "Possible perimeter breach," she said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "Communications compromised, multiple anomalies on perimeter sensors. I've initiated lockdown protocols." "Understand. Stand by." The connection cut to static. Through her tablet, she could see Mercer's location beacon moving toward the security office. At least he was responding to the alert. At 0:38, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing the station in red light and casting long shadows across the corridors. But the main power grid was down, which meant someone had reached the primary electrical systems. Elara's training took over. She switched her console to battery power and activated the emergency communication array. The backup system had limited range, but might penetrate whatever was blocking their signals. "All stations, this is Control," she broadcast on the internal frequency. "We have lost main power. Possible hostile contact. All personnel implement emergency protocols immediately." As if in response to her announcement, she heard the sound of metal being cut somewhere deep in the station's infrastructure. Someone was inside, moving through the maintenance areas with tools and purpose. The emergency lighting transformed Station Omega-7 into a maze of blood-red shadows and harsh geometric silhouettes. Dr. Elara Quinn remained at her console as chaos erupted around her, her fingers dancing across keys that glowed like embers in the crimson twilight. Through the operations hub's reinforced windows, she could see her colleagues emerging from their quarters. Dr. Mina Sorel appeared first, clutching a tablet containing her climate research data and looking around with the bewildered expression of someone pulled from deep sleep. Tomas Reddick followed, his engineer's instincts already focused on the mechanical symphony of backup systems spinning up to compensate for the power loss. "Quinn!" Captain Jonas Mercer's voice cut through the ambient noise as he strode into the operations hub. His security uniform was half-buttoned, but he carried his sidearm and moved with the alertness of someone accustomed to crisis. "Talk to me, what's our situation?" Elara didn't look up from her displays. Primary power severed at 0:38, communication array compromised by unknown interference. Perimeter sensors detected movement at multiple points before the blackout. Her voice remained steady, professional. "I've implemented lockdown protocols, but we have to assume hostile contact." Mercer moved to stand behind her chair, studying the security feeds that remained operational. Half the cameras showed static or empty frames, but the functioning units painted a disturbing picture. Footprints in the snow led to ventilation intakes. Service panels that should have been sealed hung open like wounds in the station's hull. "How many?" he asked. "Insufficient data. At least 3 separate approach vectors based on sensor readings. Possibly more." Elara switched between camera feeds, enhancing images where possible. "They knew our blind spots." The implication hung in the air between them. Station Omega-7 security arrangements weren't classified, but they weren't public knowledge either. Whoever was out there had done their homework. Layla Vance appeared in the doorway, her communications specialist uniform thrown on hastily over thermal underwear. Her usually neat hair hung in disarray, but her expression was sharp with professional focus. "Internal comms are holding, but I can't raise Whitehorse or any of the other stations. Something's jamming everything above VHF frequencies." "Solar storm?" Mercer asked. Elara shook her head. "Storm activity is elevated, but this is too precise. The interference targets specific frequency ranges while leaving others clear." She pulled up her earlier analysis. "Someone's using sophisticated electronic countermeasures." A new sound echoed through the station's corridors, the rhythmic scraping of metal against metal. It came from somewhere below them, transmitted through the building's steel skeleton. Tomas Reddick's voice crackled over the intercom from the engineering section. Someone's cutting through the maintenance bulkheads down here. Professional job. They've got thermal tools. Mercer grabbed his radio. Reddick, get away from there. Fall back to the central hub. Negative. They're going for the backup generators. If they take those out, we lose life support within 6 hours. Tomas's voice carried the grim determination of someone who understood the mathematics of survival. I can keep the auxiliary power online, but I need to reach the secondary control room. Elara studied the station schematic on her tablet. The auxiliary generators occupied a separate wing, connected to the main structure by utility tunnels that ran beneath the permafrost. Reaching them would require traversing the same maintenance areas where intruders were already operating. I can guide him, she said. The utility maps show 3 possible routes. 2 are compromised, but the third connects through the research lab sub-basement. Mercer looked skeptical. You're sure about the routing? I've walked every meter of this station, Elara replied. I know which passages connect where, which doors will seal properly, and which routes avoid the main ventilation system. She had spent countless night shifts exploring the facility, mapping its quirks, and understanding its systems. What others saw as excessive behavior might now keep them alive. At 047, the perimeter alarms sounded again. This time, they didn't cut off. The wailing siren filled the station with urgent noise, while Elara's remaining security cameras showed new movement outside. Figures in Arctic camouflage approached the main entrance, moving with military precision through the blowing snow. They're not trying to be subtle anymore, Layla observed, adjusting her makeshift communication setup. Whatever they wanted to accomplish quietly, they've got it. Now they're coming in force. Elara counted at least 6 hostiles on the surviving cameras. They carried weapons and moved in formation, covering each other's advance with professional competence. These weren't opportunistic thieves or desperate researchers seeking shelter. This was a military operation. Reddick, report, Mercer commanded. Auxiliary generators are still online, but barely. Someone sabotaged the fuel lines, just enough to cause gradual failure, not immediate shutdown. Give me 20 minutes and I can reroute around the damage. You may not have 20 minutes, Elara said, watching the tactical display. They're positioning for simultaneous breach at 3 points. Main entrance, emergency exit, and... She paused, enhancing one of the camera feeds. The loading dock. They'll be inside within 5 minutes. Doctor, Mina Sorrell had been listening from the doorway, clutching her research tablet like a shield. Now she stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled fear. What do they want? This is a climate research station. We don't have weapons or strategic materials. Elara looked at her colleague's tablet, then at the climate monitoring systems that formed the backbone of their scientific mission. Information, she said quietly. Your atmospheric modeling data, the long-term climate projections, the polar ice shift calculations. In the wrong hands, that data could be worth billions. The implications were staggering. Governments and corporations would pay enormous sums for advanced knowledge of climate changes that could affect agriculture, shipping routes, and natural resource extraction. Dr. Sorrell's research represented years of irreplaceable observations from one of the planet's most sensitive environmental monitoring points. They can't have it, Mina said firmly. This isn't just research. It's the foundation for global climate adaptation strategies. Without accurate data, millions of people could die in floods, droughts, or storms we might have predicted and prepared for. At 052, the lights in the eastern corridor went out. The intruders had reached the secondary power distribution panel. Emergency lighting continued to function, but the loss of normal illumination meant they were systematically dismantling the station's infrastructure. Time's up, Mercer announced. He checked his weapon and started toward the door. Vance, maintain communications. Quinn, coordinate from here. I'm going to. Stop, Elara's voice cut through his declaration with quiet authority. You'll be walking into a kill zone. They control the eastern approaches. They've mapped our defensive positions from the outside, and they have superior numbers. Mercer turned back, irritation flashing across his features. Then what do you suggest? We can't just wait here for them to break down the door. We use what they don't have, Elara replied, pulling up detailed schematics on her console. Complete knowledge of this station's layout, systems, and environmental controls. They may have architectural drawings, but they don't know the maintenance schedules, the equipment quirks, or the emergency procedures. She highlighted sections of the building plan as she spoke. The heating system can be rerouted to create temperature differentials that will fog their thermal imaging. The ventilation system can be pressurized to create acoustic shadows that will mask our movements. And the emergency protocols can seal blast doors in sequences they won't anticipate. Layla looked up from her communications gear. You want to fight them with HVAC systems? I want to fight them with superior preparation, Elara corrected. They're trained for conventional assault scenarios, but this isn't a conventional building, and we're not conventional defenders. A new sound echoed through the station, the sharp crack of an emergency door being forced open. The intruders had breached the main entrance. Mercer drew his weapon and moved toward the corridor. We'll try it your way, Quinn, but if this doesn't work... It will work, she said with quiet confidence. Reddick, can you reach the environmental controls from your position? Affirmative. What do you need? Elara's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. Initiate Thermal Lockdown Protocol 7. Vent all heated air from corridors 2 through 6, then spike the temperature in corridor 7 to maximum. I want a wall of superheated air between us and them. That'll use a lot of power, Tomas warned. We only need it for 3 minutes, Elara replied, long enough to execute Phase 2. At 0:57, the temperature differential triggered. Through the security cameras, they could see the effects immediately. The intruders' thermal imaging equipment became useless as clouds of condensation filled the corridors. Their tactical advantage evaporated in a fog of water vapor and confusion. Phase 2, Elara announced, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Mercer, take position at Junction 4. Vance, prepare to cut all lighting in Section B on my signal. Everyone else, trust the plan and move exactly where I tell you. As the station systems responded to her commands, Dr. Elara Quinn felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was what she had been preparing for during all those lonely night shifts. Not the specific scenario, but the moment when detailed knowledge and careful planning would mean the difference between life and death. The intruders were inside now, but they were entering her domain. The first gunshot shattered the relative quiet at 103. Dr. Elara Quinn felt the sound like a physical blow, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of their situation crystallized. Through her headset, she heard Captain Mercer's harsh breathing as he pressed himself against the corridor wall, his service weapon drawn. Contact Junction 4, he whispered into his radio. One hostile, moving toward the climate lab. He's got body armor and what looks like military-grade night vision. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Copy that, Elara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. On her console, she tracked the intruder's heat signature through the environmental sensors. Turn left at the next intersection. There's a service alcove 15 meters ahead, where you can observe without being exposed. Through the security cameras that remained functional, she watched the deadly chess game unfold. The intruders moved with professional competence, but they were operating in an environment she knew like her own heartbeat. Every room, every corridor, every hidden passage had been catalogued during her methodical night shifts. Tomas Reddick's voice crackled through the intercom from deep in the station's mechanical systems. Elara, I've got the auxiliary generators stabilized, but I'm seeing signs of sabotage on the fuel lines. Someone knew exactly what to target to cause gradual failure rather than immediate shutdown. How long until total power loss? She asked, her fingers dancing across the environmental controls. Maybe 4 hours if they don't do any more damage. Less if they hit the backup fuel pumps. 4 hours. Elara filed that information away with the dozens of other variables she was tracking. Outside, the Arctic storm continued to rage, making evacuation impossible and rescue unlikely. They were on their own until the weather cleared. Layla Vance looked up from her improvised communications station, her face illuminated by the glow of jury-rigged displays. I'm picking up radio chatter on a frequency just outside normal security channels. They're using some kind of digital encryption, but the carrier wave suggests at least 8 hostiles. 8. More than the 6 they had visually confirmed. Elara adjusted her tactical assessment, redistributing her defensive priorities across the station's layout. Any luck breaking the encryption? Mercer asked from his position. Give me 20 minutes with a computer cluster in the research lab, Layla replied. If I can access the pattern analysis software Dr. Sorrell uses for climate modeling, I might be able to crack their communication protocol. Dr. Mina Sorrell had been silent since the shooting started, clutching her research tablet and staring at the tactical display with wide eyes. Now she looked up with sudden understanding. They're not just after the data. They need me to interpret it. Raw observational data is useless without the analytical frameworks and contextual knowledge to understand what it means. That changed everything. Elara quickly revised her defensive strategy. The intruders wouldn't risk damaging Dr. Sorrell or destroying the research data if they needed both intact. That gave them leverage, but it also made Mina a primary target for capture rather than elimination. New priority, she announced over the communications network. Dr. Sorrell needs secure escort to the emergency shelter in sub-basement 2. The rest of us maintain defensive positions until she's secured. Negative, Mina replied firmly. My lab contains backup copies of 5 years' worth of irreplaceable climate observations. If they get access to both me and the data, they won't need anything else. I'm staying to ensure the research is protected. At 1:09, the lights in the western corridor died. The intruders were systematically eliminating their vision while maintaining their own night vision advantage. But Elara had prepared for this possibility during her endless night shifts, mapping the station's emergency lighting and understanding exactly which systems would remain functional during power failures. Switching to infrared, she announced, adjusting her console to thermal imaging mode. The station's internal sensors had been designed to monitor equipment temperatures, but they could track human heat signatures just as effectively. I have visual on 3 hostiles in the maintenance section, 2 more approaching the communications array. Tomas's voice came through with background noise of machinery and echoing metal. I can see them from the generator room. They're trying to access the primary data server through the utility tunnel. Give me 2 minutes and I can flood that passage with steam from the heating system. Do it, Elara confirmed. Mercer, fall back to position 7. There's going to be a lot of vapor in 30 seconds. The environmental controls responded to her commands with mechanical precision. Deep in the station's infrastructure, heating coils superheated water until it exploded into steam, filling the utility tunnel with scalding fog that would defeat night vision and force the intruders to retreat. Through her headset, she heard the satisfying sounds of confusion and tactical radio chatter as the assault team encountered unexpected resistance. Phase 3, she announced. Vance, initiate communication protocol Delta. I want all internal frequencies cycling every 30 seconds. Mercer, advance to junction 9, but watch for booby traps. They've had time to set charges. Layla's fingers flew across her makeshift control panel. Frequency cycling initiated. They'll have to adjust their radios continuously to maintain contact with each other. As if in response to their defensive measures, the intruders escalated their assault. A controlled explosion shook the station at 1:15, blowing open the emergency exit with enough force to rattle equipment in the operations hub. Breaching charge, Mercer reported. Professional demolition work. We're dealing with military specialists, not industrial saboteurs. Through the security cameras, Elara watched 4 figures in Arctic camouflage pour through the breached entrance. They moved with tactical precision, covering angles and communicating through hand signals that suggested extensive training in close-quarters combat. But training couldn't compensate for unfamiliarity with the environment. As the intruders advanced through the station's corridors, they triggered motion sensors that Elara had reprogrammed to trace their movements. Every step they took provided more information about their numbers, equipment, and tactical approach. Reddick, can you access the fire suppression system from your position? She asked. Affirmative. What do you have in mind? Corridor flooding. If we can trigger the emergency deluge system in sections 3 and 4, we can create water barriers that will slow their advance and interfere with their equipment. That'll drain our emergency water reserves, Tomas warned. We won't need emergency reserves if we don't survive the next hour, Elara replied grimly. At 1:18, water began cascading through the station's corridors. The fire suppression system had been designed to flood compartments with enough water to extinguish chemical fires, but it served equally well as a tactical obstacle. The intruders found themselves wading through ankle-deep water that soaked their equipment and made rapid movement impossible. More importantly, the water conducted sound in ways that gave Elara's team acoustic advantages. Through the station's PA system, she could track the intruders' movements by the splash patterns they created. "Contact!" Mercer's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Two hostiles, Junction 12. They're trying to flank around the flooded sections." Elara quickly pulled up the architectural drawings and traced possible routes. "There's a maintenance hatch 3 meters to your left. If you can reach it without being spotted, you'll have elevated position over their approach." She heard the scrape of metal and Mercer's controlled breathing as he maneuvered through the cramped maintenance space. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that could conceal movement if used properly. "Visual on targets," he reported. "They're carrying encrypted radios and what looks like data storage equipment. Definitely here for the research files." "Can you disable them without killing them?" Elara asked. Corpses wouldn't provide intelligence about the scope of the operation or the identity of who had sent them. "Working on it." At 1:23, she heard the sound of a scuffle, followed by Mercer's voice. "Two down, non-lethal, but I've got their radio equipment." Layla immediately began working to decrypt the captured communication devices. Within minutes, fragments of tactical chatter began coming through the operations hub speakers. Secondary objective: compromised. Require immediate extraction. Target is still secure in laboratory section. Dr. Sorrell looked up from her research tablet with grim understanding. "They're not just trying to steal the data, they're planning to extract me along with it." That information changed Elara's defensive calculations once again. If the intruders were planning an extraction, they had support waiting outside the station. Air support, most likely, since ground vehicles would be useless in the current storm conditions. "New threat assessment," she announced over the communications network. "Assume hostile air support within 30 minutes. We need to deny them landing capability and prevent extraction of personnel or data." She began typing commands into the environmental control system, preparing to activate heating elements around the station's landing pad. If she could create enough thermal turbulence, landing would become extremely hazardous, even for experienced pilots. At 1:27, the communications array exploded. The blast was controlled and precise, designed to destroy equipment while leaving the building structure intact, but it eliminated their last hope of calling for outside assistance. "That's it," Layla announced, staring at her dead communication equipment. "We're completely cut off until the storm passes." Elara felt a cold calm settle over her as the full scope of their isolation became clear. No cavalry was coming. No rescue helicopters would brave the storm. They were alone in the Arctic darkness with professional killers who wanted Dr. Sorrell and her research data. But they still had advantages. The intruders were operating in an unfamiliar environment during the worst weather conditions on Earth. They were fighting opponents who knew every meter of the battlefield and understood exactly how to use the station's systems as weapons. "Reddick, report on generator status," she commanded. "Auxiliary power holding steady. I've rerouted around most of the sabotage, but they'll try again once they realize we're still operational." "Vance, what's our status on the captured communications?" "Partial decrypt achieved. They're using military-grade encryption, but I'm getting tactical updates. 6 hostiles confirmed inside the station, at least 2 more maintaining perimeter security." "Mercer, position report?" "Holding Junction 15. I can see movement in the laboratory section. They're definitely going after Dr. Sorrell's data storage systems." Elara studied the tactical display, weighing their options. The intruders were closing in on their primary objective, but they were also becoming increasingly spread out through the station's complex layout. That created opportunities for someone who understood the building's hidden passages and emergency systems. "All stations, prepare for Phase 4, she announced. "We're going to make them think we're retreating toward the emergency bunker, then cut them off when they pursue." "Dr. Sorrell, you'll need to play the part of a panicked scientist fleeing with her research data." "I am a panicked scientist," Mina replied, but there was steel in her voice. "Just tell me what you need me to do." As the battle for Station Omega-7 entered its most critical phase, Dr. Elara Quinn felt the weight of leadership settling across her shoulders. Her colleagues were looking to her for guidance, trusting her quiet competence to keep them alive through the long Arctic night. She had spent 18 months preparing for this moment without knowing it, learning every system and memorizing every passage. Now, all that careful observation and methodical planning would be tested against trained killers who had underestimated the power of preparation. The real fight was just beginning. At 1:34, the encrypted device Captain Mercer had captured began transmitting a steady pulse. Dr. Elara Quinn watched the signal pattern on her console, her analytical mind racing through the implications. The device wasn't just a communication tool, it was a beacon, broadcasting coordinates and status updates to someone beyond the storm's reach. "They're calling for extraction," she announced to the team scattered throughout the station. "This was never meant to be a stealth operation." They planned to get in, grab what they needed, and get out before we could mount organized resistance. Through her headset, she heard Dr. Mina Sorrell's sharp intake of breath from the climate laboratory. "How long do we have?" Elara studied the meteorological data streaming across her displays. "The storm won't clear for another 6 hours minimum. But helicopter extraction is possible in these conditions if the pilots are experienced enough and desperate enough." Layla Vance looked up from her jury-rigged communication station, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "I'm tracking multiple encrypted signals now. They're not just talking to extraction, they're coordinating with additional ground units." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a containable infiltration was evolving into a full-scale assault with air support and reinforcements. The station's defensive advantages would mean nothing if they were overwhelmed by superior numbers. "Dr. Sorrell," Elara called over the intercom, "I need you to secure all research data and prepare for emergency evacuation of the laboratory." "Absolutely not." Mina's voice carried the steel determination of someone who had spent years fighting for every scrap of funding and recognition in the male-dominated world of climate science. "This data represents 5 years of irreplaceable observations. Without it, our understanding of Arctic climate systems will be set back by decades." Elara felt frustration building in her chest. She understood the scientific imperative. The climate data was genuinely irreplaceable and critically important, but she also understood the tactical reality of their situation. "Dr. Sorrell, if they capture you and the data, the information will be used for political and economic manipulation rather than climate protection. Your research will cause more harm than help." "Then we make sure they don't capture it," Mina replied firmly. At 1:41, the sound of cutting torches echoed through the station's eastern wall. Tomas Reddick's voice crackled through the intercom from his position near the auxiliary generators. "They're going through the outer bulkhead like it's paper. Professional thermal cutting equipment, military grade. They'll be through the hull in 10 minutes." Elara pulled up the station's structural schematics, tracing the location of the breach attempt. The intruders were targeting the science wing directly, bypassing the station's main defenses to reach Dr. Sorrell's laboratory. "They've done their reconnaissance," she murmured, her fingers flying across the environmental controls. "They know exactly where the climate data is stored." Captain Mercer's voice came through with the controlled tension of someone under fire. "Quinn, I count at least 4 more hostiles outside the eastern perimeter. They're using the storm as cover, but I can see muzzle flashes when they move." 4 more hostiles meant at least 12 total, twice their original estimate. The attackers had committed significant resources to this operation, suggesting the climate data was worth far more than anyone had realized. "New defensive priority," Elara announced, her voice carrying new authority. "We're going to make the science wing uninhabitable." She began typing commands into the environmental control system with practiced efficiency. The station's heating system could be reversed, using the Arctic environment as a weapon rather than an obstacle. "Rerouting thermal systems now," she reported. "All heated air from the eastern section will be vented outside. Internal temperature in the science wing will drop to external ambient within 20 minutes. "That's minus 40 degrees, Layla protested. "The equipment won't survive those temperatures." "Neither will unprotected intruders," Elara replied grimly. "Dr. Sorrell, how long do you need to download critical data to portable storage?" 15 minutes for the essential climate models, 30 for the complete dataset. Quote, "You have 10 minutes. After that, we're flooding the wing with unheated air." At 1:47, the eastern bulkhead gave way. Through the security cameras, Elara watched figures in advanced cold weather gear pour through the breach. They moved with military precision, but their thermal signatures were clearly visible against the rapidly cooling background of the science wing. "Initiating temperature differential protocol," she announced, her fingers dancing across the controls. "Tomas, I need you to shut down all heating elements in sections 4 through 7. "Copy that," Reddick replied. "But we're going to lose a lot of sensitive equipment if we freeze the labs." "Better to lose equipment than lives," Elara responded, watching the tactical display as the intruders advanced through corridors that were already dropping below freezing. The environmental warfare was working. The attackers' movements became sluggish as the extreme cold penetrated their gear. Their thermal imaging equipment began malfunctioning as ice crystals formed on the lenses. But they adapted quickly, producing portable heating units and adjusting their tactics to account for the hostile environment. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were specialists trained for Arctic operations. "They're still advancing," Mercer reported from his observation post. "The cold is slowing them down, but they're prepared for extreme weather operations." Dr. Sorrell's voice came through with barely controlled panic. "I need more time. The data transfer is only at 60%. Elara made a command decision that would define the next phase of the battle. "Mercer, fall back to the central hub. Vance, prepare to cut all power to the eastern section. We're going to trap them in the dark and cold." "What about Dr. Sorrell?" Layla asked. "She evacuates to the emergency shelter in 30 seconds, with or without complete data transfer." At 1:52, Station Omega-7 became a battlefield divided between fire and ice. The emergency blast doors slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing the eastern section from the rest of Station Omega-7, but the victory was temporary. Drive Elara Quinn could see through her thermal sensors that the intruders were already working to bypass the barriers. "Status report," she called over the intercom, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Captain Mercer's response came through labored breathing. "2 of my security team are down. Not killed, but hypothermia got them before they could reach the safe zone. The intruders are using some kind of plasma cutter on the blast doors." Through her console, Elara watched the heat signatures of the trapped infiltrators as they methodically worked to escape their frozen prison. Their thermal signatures showed they were burning through portable heating fuel at an unsustainable rate, but they were also making steady progress through the supposedly impenetrable barriers. "Time estimate for breach?" she asked. 20 minutes, maybe less," Tomas Reddick reported from his position near the auxiliary power systems. "Those doors weren't designed to withstand industrial cutting tools." 20 minutes. Elara's mind raced through tactical possibilities, environmental options, and the dwindling resources at their disposal. The station's defensive systems had been designed for environmental protection, not military assault. At 2:03, Captain Mercer made a decision that nearly cost them everything. "I'm taking a team outside," he announced over the radio. "We'll flank them through the equipment storage area and hit them while they're focused on the doors." "Negative," Elara replied immediately. "Visibility outside is 0. Wind speed is over 70 kilometers per hour, and the temperature will kill you in minutes." "We can't just wait for them to cut their way out," Mercer protested. "Once they breach those doors, we lose our defensive advantage." Elara understood his frustration. Military training emphasized aggressive action and decisive engagement, but the Arctic environment made conventional tactics suicidal. "Give me 3 minutes," she said. "I have another option." Her fingers flew across the environmental controls, pulling up systems she had studied but never used operationally. The station's fire suppression system could be weaponized, but not in the way she had used it before. "Tomas, can you access the industrial oxygen tanks from your position?" she asked. "Affirmative. What do you need?" "I want you to flood the eastern section with pure oxygen, then ignite it with the emergency heating coils." The silence on the radio lasted several seconds before Layla Vance spoke up. "Elara, that could destroy half the station." "It will definitely destroy the intruders," Elara replied grimly, "and their equipment, and any chance of them completing their mission." Dr. Mina Sorrell's voice came through with horror. "My research data is still in that section, years of irreplaceable climate observations." Elara felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She was proposing to destroy the very thing they were trying to protect, in order to prevent it from falling into hostile hands. Before she could implement the plan, the blast doors exploded inward. The intruders had used shaped charges to blow the barriers, filling the central corridor with smoke and debris. Through her security cameras, Elara watched figures in advanced cold-weather gear pour through the breach, their weapons raised and their movements coordinated. "Contact!" Mercer's voice cut through the radio chatter as gunfire erupted in the corridors. But the captain's flanking maneuver had put him in the worst possible position. The storm outside had completely disoriented his team, and they stumbled back into the station just as the intruders broke through the blast doors. "Man down!" Layla's voice carried panic as she reported from her communication post. Mercer's hit looks like a ricochet in the shoulder, and Torres took a direct hit to the leg. 2 more casualties. Elara's defensive plan was collapsing as the reality of armed combat overwhelmed her environmental tactics. At 2:11, she made the decision that would define her leadership. "All personnel, fall back to secondary defensive positions," she commanded over the intercom. "I'm taking operational control of the defense." Through her console, she activated systems she had hoped never to use. Emergency blast doors sealed at strategic intervals, creating a maze of barriers that would force the intruders to move through predetermined corridors. Atmospheric controls created pressure differentials that would make their movements audible from hundreds of meters away. "Tomas, can you reach the auxiliary control room?" she asked. "Affirmative, but I'll have to go through sections they're trying to secure." "Do it. I'm going to guide you through the maintenance tunnels." Her fingers traced routes on the architectural schematics that only she knew by heart. 18 months of methodical exploration were about to save their lives. "Layla, maintain communication coordination. Dr. Sorrell, prepare the emergency data purge protocol. If they reach the primary servers, we destroy everything rather than let them have it." At 2:17, the intruders planted a device against the primary data vault. Through her thermal sensors, Elara watched the specialized equipment being positioned with military precision. It wasn't an explosive. It was some kind of electronic interface designed to crack the vault's security systems. "They're not trying to destroy the data," she realized aloud. "They want it intact and accessible." That changed everything. The attackers needed the information in usable form, which meant they couldn't risk damaging the servers or corrupting the files. It gave Elara's team leverage, but it also meant the intruders would be more careful and methodical in their approach. "New plan," she announced. "We're going to make them think they've succeeded, then trap them when they try to extract the data." As the battle for Station Omega-7 entered its most critical phase, Dr. Elara Quinn felt the full weight of command settling across her shoulders. Her colleagues' lives depended on decisions she had never been trained to make, fighting an enemy she had never imagined facing. But she had spent 18 months learning every system, every passage, and every emergency protocol in the station. Now that knowledge would be tested against trained killers who had underestimated the power of preparation and intimate familiarity with the battlefield. At 2:23, Dr. Elara Quinn made a decision that would have terrified her 6 hours earlier. She was going hunting. "I'm entering the ventilation system," she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Tomas, meet me at access point 7. We're going to use the infrastructure they don't know exists." The station's ventilation system was a 3-dimensional maze of passages, maintenance shafts, and emergency routes that connected every section of the facility. Elara had mapped every meter during her methodical night shifts, understanding not just the official architectural drawings but the actual quirks and modifications that accumulated over years of operation. "Quinn, that's suicide," Captain Mercer protested from his position in the medical bay, where Layla Vance was treating his shoulder wound. "Those passages are barely wide enough for one person, and if they find you in there—" "They won't find me," Elara interrupted, pulling on her emergency gear. "But I'll find them." Through her tablet, she could track the intruders' heat signatures as they moved through the station's corridors. They were operating in 2-person teams, communicating through hand signals, and maintaining tactical formation. Professional, disciplined, and completely unfamiliar with the building's hidden infrastructure. Tomas Reddick met her at the maintenance access point, his face grim but determined. "I've rigged the main ventilation fans to create variable pressure zones," he reported. "When you give the signal, I can generate whiteout conditions inside the passages." Elara nodded, checking her portable tablet and emergency radio. Dr. Sorrell, report status. Mina's voice came through with controlled fear. I'm in the concealed alcove behind the secondary data storage. The primary vault has been compromised, but they haven't found the backup drives yet. At 2:31, Elara entered the ventilation system. The passages were cramped and cold, lined with frost from the Arctic air that circulated through the station's life support systems. But they were also invisible to the intruder's thermal imaging, shielded by insulation and metal ducting that masked heat signatures. Through the tablet strapped to her wrist, she tracked enemy positions while navigating by memory through the three-dimensional maze. The intruders had split into 3 teams. 2 searching for Dr. Sorrell and the research data, 1 maintaining perimeter security. Tomas, initiate pressure differential sequence alpha, she whispered into her radio. The response was immediate. Industrial fans throughout the station began cycling at varying speeds, creating air currents that filled the passages with swirling ice crystals and condensation. Visibility dropped to 0 within seconds. But Elara didn't need to see. She had walked these passages dozens of times, memorizing every junction and understanding exactly how the airflow patterns would affect movement and sound. At 2:38, she encountered her first target. The intruder was crouched at a junction between the laboratory section and the main corridor, his attention focused on the corridor below. He wore advanced night vision equipment and carried what looked like a modified assault rifle, but he was completely exposed to attack from above. Elara positioned herself directly over his location and waited. Through her tablet, she could see his partner approaching from the opposite direction. They were using subtle hand signals to coordinate their movement, professional military communication that suggested extensive training. When both intruders were positioned beneath her access point, she dropped a flashbang grenade she had taken from the security office. The explosion in the confined space was devastating. Both attackers were incapacitated immediately, their night vision equipment ruined, and their hearing destroyed by the acoustic assault in the metal-lined corridor. 2 down in Section 4, she reported over the radio, moving to intercept Team 2. Captain Mercer's voice came through with newfound respect. Outstanding work, Quinn, but be careful. They'll adapt to your tactics once they realize what's happening. He was right. Through her surveillance network, she could see the remaining intruders regrouping and adjusting their approach. They were no longer moving in predictable patterns, and they had begun watching the ceiling for signs of movement in the ventilation system. At 2:45, she nearly walked into a trap. The third team had positioned themselves at a major junction in the ventilation system, waiting for her to appear. Only her intimate knowledge of the station's layout saved her. She detected the ambush through subtle changes in air pressure that indicated blocked passages. Tomas, I need emergency venting in Section 6, she whispered into her radio. Full atmospheric dump. The response was immediate and violent. Emergency vents opened throughout the section, creating a howling wind that filled the passages with ice crystals and made movement impossible. The waiting intruders were forced to retreat to areas with more stable air pressure. But the maneuver revealed her position to the remaining attackers. Through her tablet, she could see them converging on her location with grim determination. They know where I am, she reported, beginning evasive protocols. At 2:52, the hunt became a chase. Elara moved through the ventilation maze with desperate speed, using every shortcut and hidden passage she had discovered during her methodical exploration. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit, metal clanging against metal as the intruders followed her trail. But they were operating in an environment she understood better than they did. When they reached junction points, she was already 3 moves ahead. When they tried to cut her off, she had already shifted to alternate routes they didn't know existed. Quinn, report status, Mercer called over the radio. Playing cat and mouse, she replied, pausing at an access point to catch her breath. But I think I'm the mouse. Through her tablet, she watched the tactical situation developing. The intruders were being drawn deeper into the station's infrastructure, away from their primary objectives. But they were also learning the layout with each passing minute. At 2:58, she made contact with the enemy leader. The encounter happened in a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for one person. Elara was crawling toward an exit when she came face to face with an intruder moving in the opposite direction. For a moment, they stared at each other in the cramped space, both too surprised to react. Then, training took over. The intruder lunged forward with a combat knife, while Elara rolled backward and triggered the emergency pressure release for the section. The sudden atmospheric change created a wind tunnel that threw both of them against the passage walls. In the confused struggle that followed, Elara managed to disable her attacker's radio and escape through an emergency hatch, but she had seen his face clearly, professional, determined, and completely ruthless. "They're not giving up," she reported over the radio, "and they're better than I expected." As the chase continued through the station's hidden infrastructure, Dr. Elara Quinn realized that her advantages were temporary. The intruders were learning the layout, adapting to her tactics, and closing the gaps in their operational knowledge. The real test was still coming. At 3:15, Station Omega-7 fell silent. The absence of sound was more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. Dr. Elara Quinn crouched in the ventilation shaft, listening to the complete stillness that had descended over the facility. No footsteps, no radio chatter, no mechanical sounds beyond the essential life support systems. "All stations, report status," she whispered into her radio. One by one, her team responded from their defensive positions throughout the station. Captain Mercer from the medical bay, his shoulder wound treated but his mobility limited. Tomas Reddick from the auxiliary power station, maintaining the systems that kept them alive. Layla Vance from her improvised communication post, monitoring frequencies for enemy transmissions. "I don't like this," Mercer said over the radio. "Professional assault teams don't just disappear." Elara emerged from the ventilation system into the mess hall, her body aching from crawling through cramped passages for over an hour. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the empty tables and chairs, creating an atmosphere of abandonment that belied the station's normal purpose. Through her tablet, she studied the thermal imaging data from the station's sensors. Heat signatures showed her team members in their known positions, but the intruders had vanished completely. Either they had found ways to mask their thermal output, or they had withdrawn to areas beyond the sensor network's coverage. "They're regrouping," she announced, as her colleagues gathered in the mess hall. "The question is where, and for what purpose?" Dr. Mina Sorrell emerged from her hiding place, clutching her research tablet like a lifeline. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, and her eyes showed the strain of hours spent in mortal fear. "Are they gone? Did we win?" "We survived the first wave," Elara corrected, "but this isn't over." Layla Vance looked up from her portable communication equipment, her face illuminated by the glow of multiple displays. "I'm picking up encrypted radio traffic again, but it's different now. Longer transmission bursts, more complex data patterns." She adjusted her monitoring equipment, fine-tuning the receivers to capture clearer signals. After several minutes of electronic manipulation, fragments of enemy communication began coming through the speakers. Phase 2 initiated. Simultaneous breach protocol. Extraction window confirmed. Elara felt her blood turn cold as she deciphered the tactical implications. They're not retreating, they're preparing for a coordinated assault. Multiple objectives, executed simultaneously. She pulled up the station's schematic on her tablet, overlaying it with the defensive positions they had established. The pattern became clear with horrible certainty. "Power core and data vault," she said aloud. "They're going to hit both targets at once, forcing us to choose which one to defend." Tomas Reddick's face went pale as he understood the implications. "If they breach the power core containment, we'll have less than 30 minutes before total system failure. In these temperatures, that's a death sentence for everyone in the station. And if they get the climate data," Dr. Sorrell added, "they'll have information worth billions of dollars and the ability to manipulate global climate policy for decades." The strategic dilemma was perfect from the attacker's perspective. Lara's team couldn't defend both objectives simultaneously with their limited numbers, and losing either target would constitute mission failure. At 3:28, Captain Mercer made a declaration that surprised everyone. "Quinn, you're in operational command," he announced, his military bearing unchanged despite his injured shoulder. "I'll follow your orders." The weight of that statement settled on Elara's shoulders like a physical burden. She had been coordinating their defense, but formal command was different. Her decisions would now determine who lived and who died in the coming battle. "Why?" she asked quietly. Mercer met her eyes with professional respect. "Because your tactics have kept us alive for 4 hours against superior numbers and firepower. Because you know this station better than anyone. and because conventional military approaches don't work in this environment. Layla and Tomas nodded their agreement. Even Dr. Sorrell, despite her terror, looked at Elara with trust and expectation. "All right," Elara said, accepting the responsibility she had never wanted. "Here's what we're going to do." She pulled up the station's engineering schematics and began outlining her defensive strategy. It was ambitious, risky, and dependent on precise timing and coordination. "Tomas, you'll defend the power core with environmental warfare. Use the cooling systems to create ice barriers and thermal differentials that make approach impossible. Mercer, despite your injury, you're our mobile response. Move between positions as needed, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary." She turned to Layla and Dr. Sorrell. "You two will implement a data security protocol I've been developing. We're going to make them think they've succeeded in stealing the research, then trap them with corrupted information that will be useless for their purposes." "What about you?" Mercer asked. Elara looked at the tactical display, calculating probabilities and resource allocation with the methodical precision that had defined her entire career. "I'm going to be everywhere they don't expect me to be." At 3:34, the final assault began. Through the station's sensor network, Elara watched heat signatures moving toward both target locations with military precision. The intruders had split into two teams, each equipped for sustained combat in extreme conditions. "Initiate defensive protocols," she commanded over the radio. "All teams execute on my mark." Quote, the battle for Station Omega-7 was about to enter its final phase, with Dr. Elara Quinn directing a defense that would test every system, every contingency plan, and every ounce of preparation she had accumulated during 18 months of quiet night shifts. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the station, a different kind of tempest was about to break. At 3:47, the coordinated attack began with mechanical precision. Dr. Elara Quinn watched through her distributed sensor network as two teams of intruders moved simultaneously toward the power core and data vault. Their timing was flawless, a testament to professional training and careful planning that had anticipated exactly this moment. "Execute Phase Alpha," she commanded over the radio, her voice carrying the calm authority that had emerged over the past 4 hours. "Tomas, initiate thermal barriers at the power core. Layla, begin data corruption protocol. Mercer, mobile response position." Through her tablet, she tracked the assault in real time. Team 1, comprising 3 heavily armed intruders, approached the auxiliary power station where Tomas Reddick waited with improvised environmental defenses. Team 2, smaller, but equipped with sophisticated electronic gear, moved toward the data vault, where Dr. Mina Sorrell's research represented years of irreplaceable climate observations. "Contact at the power core," Tomas reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Initiating ice barrier sequence now." The station's cooling systems responded with mechanical efficiency. Superchilled coolant flooded the corridors surrounding the power core, creating walls of ice that formed faster than the intruders could melt them. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on their equipment, making precise movement nearly impossible. But the attackers adapted with professional competence. They produced thermal charges designed to blast through ice barriers, advancing methodically despite the hostile environment Tomas had created. "They're getting through," he reported, maybe 3 minutes before they reached the core containment. Simultaneously, Team 2 reached the data vault. "Breach at the secondary lab," Layla announced from her communication post. "They're using some kind of electronic interface to crack the security systems." Elara's fingers flew across her tablet, activating the deception protocol she had spent precious minutes preparing. The station's computers began feeding false data to the infiltrators' equipment, climate models that looked authentic but contained subtle corruptions that would make them useless for predictive analysis. "Let them think they're succeeding," she instructed. "The longer they spend downloading corrupted data, the less time they have for extraction." At 3:52, the battle reached its crisis point. An explosion echoed through the power core section as the intruders breached Tomas's ice barriers. Through her thermal sensors, Elara watched him fall back to secondary defensive positions, using his intimate knowledge of the mechanical systems to stay ahead of the advancing attackers. "Tomas, report status," she called. "They're at the containment unit," he replied, breathing hard. "I can see them placing charges on the primary coolant lines." "If those rupture—" "I know. Elara was already moving, grabbing emergency equipment from the operations hub. "Hold position for 90 seconds. I'm coming to you." Captain Mercer's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Quinn, you can't leave the command position. If you're not coordinating." "Layla can handle coordination for 3 minutes," Elara interrupted, checking her emergency gear. "The power core needs direct intervention that only I can provide." She sprinted through the station's corridors, using maintenance passages she had mapped during countless night shifts. The emergency lighting cast red shadows that turned familiar spaces into alien landscapes, but she navigated by memory and instinct. At 3:56, she reached the auxiliary power station. The scene was chaos. Tomas crouched behind a makeshift barrier of ice and machinery, while 3 intruders advanced through clouds of superheated steam. Their thermal charges had created a hellish environment of extreme temperatures and limited visibility. But Elara had planned for this moment during her methodical preparation. She activated the power core's emergency isolation protocol, sealing the reactor behind blast doors that would take significant explosive charges to penetrate. "Core secured," she announced over the radio. "They can damage peripheral systems, but they can't cause catastrophic failure." The intruders immediately shifted tactics, recognizing that their primary objective was no longer achievable. Through her tablet, she watched them begin a fighting withdrawal toward predetermined extraction points. "Data Vault team is also pulling back," Layla reported. "They've taken the corrupted files, but they don't know the information is useless yet." At 4:03, Elara realized the intruders' final gambit. "They're not extracting through ground routes," she announced, studying movement patterns on her tactical display. "They're heading for the roof, air extraction." The implications were immediate and terrifying. If the attackers reached the station's roof and successfully signaled for helicopter extraction, they would escape with what they believed was invaluable climate data. By the time their handlers discovered the information was corrupted, the operation would be complete and the infiltrators long gone. "All teams converge on vertical access routes," Elara commanded. "We cannot let them reach the roof." The Arctic storm reached its peak fury as Dr. Elara Quinn led the pursuit up Station Omega-7's emergency stairwell. Wind howled through gaps in the building structure with the sound of screaming metal, while ice crystals filled the air like horizontal rain. "Visual on targets," Captain Mercer reported through gritted teeth, his injured shoulder making the climb agonizing. 4 intruders, heading for the communication array on the roof. Through the stairwell's reinforced windows, Elara could see the outline of the station's roof equipment through the blowing snow. The communication array, damaged but not destroyed, would still be capable of transmitting an extraction signal if the intruders could power it with portable equipment. "Tomas, can you kill power to the roof array?" she called over the radio. "Negative," Reddick replied from his position in the auxiliary power station. "They've rerouted around my controls, but I can disable the landing beacon. Make it harder for extraction aircraft to find the station." "Do it." At 4:17, they reached the roof access door. The blast of Arctic air that greeted them was like stepping into a frozen hell. The temperature was minus 45 degrees Celsius, with wind gusts that threatened to knock them off their feet. Visibility was measured in meters rather than kilometers, and the ice-covered roof surface was treacherous beyond description. But Elara had prepared for this environment during her 18 months at the station. She knew the roof layout, understood the wind patterns that created relatively sheltered areas, and had memorized the locations of safety equipment that could mean the difference between survival and death. "Stay close and follow my lead," she shouted over the howling wind. "The footing is worse than it looks." Through the swirling snow, they could see the intruders struggling with their own equipment near the communication array. The storm that protected Station Omega-7 from outside interference was also making their extraction nearly impossible. At 4:21, the confrontation became physical. The first intruder appeared through the snow like a ghost, his weapon raised and his face hidden behind Arctic gear. But the extreme conditions made accurate shooting nearly impossible, and his first shots went wide in the howling wind. Captain Mercer, despite his injured shoulder, engaged with the professional competence of a trained soldier. The 2 men grappled on the ice-slick roof surface, their struggle made surreal by the storm's fury and the red glow of emergency lighting. Elara moved toward the communication array, where 2 more intruders were frantically trying to establish contact with their extraction aircraft. She could see the portable power unit they had brought, its cables snaking across the roof toward the damaged antenna array. "The antenna's live," she reported over the radio. "They're trying to boost the signal with portable amplifiers." At exactly the moment when their emergency beacon would have transmitted coordinates to the extraction helicopter, Elara reached the power unit and yanked the primary cable connection. The transmission died instantly, leaving the intruders stranded on the roof in conditions that would kill them within hours. "Extraction denied," she announced with grim satisfaction. The remaining intruders, realizing their situation was hopeless, began a desperate fighting retreat toward the station's edge. But the storm that had protected them during their approach now became their enemy, disorienting them and making escape impossible. At 4:28, the last intruder disappeared into the white void. Whether he had fallen from the roof or simply been swallowed by the storm was impossible to determine. The Arctic night had claimed its due, leaving Station Omega-7's defenders victorious but exhausted on the ice-covered rooftop. "All clear," Captain Mercer reported, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Hostiles neutralized or dispersed." As they made their way back to the relative warmth of the station's interior, Dr. Elara Quinn felt the weight of command and responsibility settling into her bones. She had led her team through the longest night of their lives, turning a research facility into a fortress and quiet preparation into decisive victory. The silence that followed was deeper than the Arctic night itself. Dr. Elara Quinn stood in the operations hub as dawn approached, though the polar winter meant no visible sunrise would mark the transition from night to day. The storm outside had begun to abate, its fury spent after hours of relentless assault on the station's defenses. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the results of the night's battle. Equipment scattered across the snow, blast marks on the station's hull, and the faint tracks where intruders had vanished into the white void. Station Omega-7 had survived, but it bore the scars of transformation from research facility to battlefield. "Damage report," she requested over the intercom, though her voice carried exhaustion that 18 months of night shifts had never produced. Tomas Reddick's response came from the auxiliary power station, where he was conducting emergency repairs. "Primary power restored, life support stable, and communications. Well, we'll need replacement equipment, but the hard line to Whitehorse is functional again." Dr. Mina Sorel emerged from the climate laboratory, clutching her research tablet with trembling hands. Her data, 5 years of irreplaceable Arctic observations, was secure, though the corrupted files the intruders had stolen would provide them with nothing useful. "Thank you," she said quietly to Elara. "You saved more than our lives tonight. You saved our ability to understand and predict climate changes that could affect millions of people." Captain Mercer appeared from the medical bay, his arm in a makeshift sling, but his bearing unchanged. "Quinn," he said formally, "I'm recommending you for commendation when we report to Regional Command. Your tactical leadership saved this station and everyone in it." Elara felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort at the recognition. She had never sought leadership or military honors. Her satisfaction came from the quiet knowledge that systems functioned properly, that preparations had been adequate, and that methodical observation had proved more valuable than aggressive heroics. "I just did what needed to be done," she replied. "No," Layla Vance interjected from her communication post, where she was already working to re-establish contact with the outside world. "You did what no one else could have done. You knew this station better than anyone, and you used that knowledge to outthink and outfight professional soldiers." At 6:30, the first clear transmission from Whitehorse Command came through. "Station OMEGA-7, this is Regional Control. We lost contact during the storm. Report status." Elara looked around at her colleagues, injured but alive, exhausted but victorious. They had faced impossible odds and emerged stronger than before. "Whitehorse Control, this is Station Omega-7, she replied into the microphone. "All personnel accounted for. Critical systems operational and research data secure. We had some uninvited guests during the storm, but they won't be bothering anyone again." As the morning progressed and rescue aircraft began their approach through clearing skies, Dr. Elara Quinn returned to her customary position at the environmental monitoring station. The instruments showed normal readings: temperature, wind speed, solar activity, and atmospheric pressure, all within expected parameters. But she knew that nothing would ever be quite normal again. Her colleagues now looked at her with respect rather than polite dismissal. her methodical preparations were seen as foresight rather than excessive caution. Her quiet competence had been tested in the crucible of life and death and had proved stronger than steel. Outside, the endless Arctic landscape stretched toward the horizon, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference. Inside station OMEGA-7, the night shift would continue, as it always had, one person maintaining vigilant watch over the instruments that measured humanity's impact on the planet's most fragile environment. Dr. Elara Quinn settled into her chair and opened her logbook to record the night's events. Her handwriting was as precise and unhurried as ever, but the words she wrote told the story of transformation, from underestimated analyst to proven leader, from quiet observer to decisive protector of irreplaceable knowledge. The Arctic night had tested them all and found them sufficient. Now the real work could continue. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.